all traditions have meditation in one form or another, and we're most familiar today with Hindu and Buddhist forms of meditation. But something very similar was going on in the Christian context from at least the 4th century, when monasticism began. Monks and nuns were living in contemplative communities where they spent a lot of their time in contemplative prayer, which is the Christian name for meditation. It's not, the word meditation was only really introduced in the late 19th century to cover this activity. The traditional view was contemplative prayer, which was often using a repetitive phrase or mantra. And then in the Eastern Orthodox and in the Roman Catholic tradition, many people use repetitive prayers with prayer beads or rosaries, which is again like a kind of mantra type of meditation. In the Sufi tradition in Islam, there are various forms of meditation, including a mantra type of meditation using one of the names of God called a wazifa, which is very similar to Hindu mantras. And Sikhs have meditation and Jains have meditation. It's present in many traditions. There are two main kinds. There's the kind that involves mantras, where you use a phrase or a word or something you repeat silently to yourself or chant out loud. And there's the mindfulness type, which involves observing the breath or sensations in the body, but without a mantra. And many people do probably about half and half split. Both of them are very common in the modern world. How many people here meditate or have meditated? Oh, well, that's almost everybody. So I don't need to tell you what it feels like, because you already know from your own experience. Well, as you know, there have been many studies on the effects of meditation. The first set of studies in the 1970s by Herbert Benson at Harvard and John Kabat-Zinn in Massachusetts, also in Massachusetts, were looking at the physiological responses, and Herbert Benson concentrated to start with on the relaxation response, the way in which meditation reduces stress. I don't know whether this morning you dealt with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system aspect of this. No? Well, the Benson was concentrating not so much on the brain, but on the physiological response of the body. As you know, we all have an unconscious body-based nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, which has two sides, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is nothing to do with sympathy, misleadingly enough. It's mostly to do with fear. When you're afraid of something, your sympathetic nervous system is activated, adrenaline goes through your bloodstream, your heart beats faster, your blood pressure goes up. And you're in a state where you're ready to fight or run away, the fight or flight reaction. The opposite is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is about not being afraid. And it's only when that system is activated that you can carry out activities that require a relaxation of the body and lack of fear, making love, for example, eating a meal, even going to the lavatory. You can't do these things if you're hyperactivated with the adrenaline system. If you're being chased across a field by an angry bull, your parasympathetic nervous system is fully activated, and good thing it is, it helps you run faster. But the last thing you think of is making love or sitting down to dinner or going to the lavatory. These things are inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, it's very necessary for us to have that response. But in the modern world, a lot of people spend their time in a state of chronic anxiety. They're afraid almost all the time. They're worried about things, or they're fearful of things that might go wrong, or anxious. And this activates the chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is very bad for health because it leads to elevated blood pressure and stress reactions, high stress hormone levels, and so on. And what Herbert Benson found was that when people meditated, Basically, for those who were suffering from stress and anxiety, it greatly reduced the activity of the sympathetic nervous system and activated the parasympathetic nervous system. That's called the relaxation response. And as a result of that, one of the effects of meditation is feeling more relaxed, being able to sleep better, and being able to be more effective in your life. And that's why many people do it. So meditation has many benefits. And as I do know you talked about this morning, can lead to changes in brain activity. The main one, when you're meditating, is a reduction in the activity of the default mode network, the part of the connection of areas in the brain that are concerned with worries and ruminations. And it can also lead to long-term anatomical changes. Not very surprising, really, if you're doing particular things with your mind and hence with your brain. Particular regions are going to become more active and the connections get better established between them. The brain is much more plastic than people used to think. We're not surprised if people who do weightlifting develop bigger muscles in their arms. And so it's not that surprising if people who meditate develop new connections in their brains or stronger connections between particular regions of the brain. Now, all this is established by science. The benefits are well known. You can learn meditation all over the world, and lots of people do it, including practically everybody here. I do it myself. I first did it in 1971 when I was a practicing atheist, and was attracted to transcendental meditation because you didn't have to believe anything, you just did it, and you could see what it did. And that's the whole point about these spiritual practices. They're all based on experience. You don't have to start off with a belief system. Well, most people, we all need belief systems. Everyone has belief systems, but you don't necessarily have to have a spiritual or religious belief system to do these practices. They're about experience and through learning through your own experience. But the reason people meditated traditionally was not so they could be more successful in love and business or sleep better, or it wasn't these secular worldly benefits that people were primarily meditating for. They were meditating because they thought it provided a way of connecting with the ultimate source of consciousness. The Hindus explain this most clearly. In one of the main schools of Hindu philosophy, the idea is that everything in the universe depends ultimately on conscious being, the mind of God, Brahman, and that this ultimate consciousness is the source of everything in the universe. And the ultimate source is conscious. That's the whole point. The ultimate being is a conscious being. And the characteristics of Brahman are threefold: Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat means being, it's conscious being. Chit means consciousness, knowledge. It's to do with names and forms, the contents of consciousness. And Ananda is joy or bliss. And the idea is that the ultimate mind of the universe is complete, not going anywhere, not trying to go anywhere else. And it's utterly blissful. It's in a permanent state of bliss. So the purpose of meditation is to connect our minds with the ultimate mind of the universe. Hindus see all conscious beings as it were, fractal reflections of the divine mind. One of their principal metaphors is of buckets of water, lots of buckets of water, just standing there, and at night reflecting the moon. And in each bucket you see a reflection of the moon. It looks like hundreds or thousands of different moons. But each of those is a reflection of the one moon, which is the source of all these reflections. And in the same way, all our minds are reflections of the ultimate mind and participate in its nature because they're derived from it. So our conscious being is part of the ultimate conscious being. Atman, our individual consciousness, is Brahman. It's linked to it and is part of it. In the Kena Upanishad, it talks about the nature of this ultimate reality. There's a series of verses which show, get over this point quite clearly. One of them is, not that which is seen by the eyes, but that whereby the eyes can see. Know that alone to be Brahman, the Lord. So it's the ability to see not what's seen. God is not a thing out there that you can study by space probes or scientific observations and quantitative measurements. It's the very ground of consciousness and knowledge itself. Another verse is, not that which is known by the mind, but that whereby the mind can know. Know that alone to be Brahman. Or not that which is heard by the ears, but that whereby the ears can hear. It's the ground of consciousness itself that links us to the ultimate reality. And sometimes teachers of meditation compare the stream of thoughts that goes through our minds when we're meditating to the clouds passing through the sky. And normally you're completely involved in your thoughts, you're involved in your ruminations, you're totally gripped by these fears, anxieties, ruminations, resentments, internal dialogue, and so on. But the meditation, by concentrating on your breathing or sensations in the body, as in mindfulness, or on your mantra, sort of splits your mind and detaches you partially from these thoughts. And then you become aware that your mind is more like the blue sky through which the clouds are passing, the ground of all these thoughts and ideas. And the more you become aware and present in that ground of consciousness, the more you become linked to the ultimate consciousness, to the being on which all consciousness depends. And the more you're linked to that, the more blissful or joyful it is, because the more linked you are to this ultimate source of joy or bliss. So that's the way in which, roughly speaking, and very abbreviated, in which this is understood by many people in India. The Christian understanding is rather similar, because all Christians, like Hindus, have the idea that God is ultimate consciousness and has three principal aspects. The ground of being in Christianity, called the Father, is essentially conscious being. And when Moses first met God in the desert, in the burning bush, and said, "Who are you?" God said, "I am who I am." It's a statement of the divine conscious being. It's defining God as conscious being and presence. But God's mind contains thoughts, ideas, forms, shapes, logic, meaning, contents. And that's the Logos, the second person of the Trinity. It's rather like a Christian assimilation of the Platonic realm of ideas into the divine being. Names and forms, as the Hindus call it. And the third aspect is the spirit, which is the dynamic principle of God, which is the breath, the wind, the flow of life, and is also joy or bliss. St. Augustine, one of the early theologians, thought of the Holy Trinity as the knower, the known, and the joy of knowing. Again, it's sort of the ground of being or knowing as the Father, the Son, or the Logos as the known, or the second person, defined in forms, shapes, connections, meanings, and the joy of the Spirit. So these spiritual practices actually traditionally have been designed to connect us with the ultimate reality. And different practices connect us with different aspects of it. You can find similar parallels to this threefold division in Sufism, and you can find in Buddhism too, there's a threefold classification of the levels of being or consciousness. So the idea is that these practices connect us with the ultimate, but different practices connect us with different aspects of the ultimate. And meditation connects us more with the ground of being, sat, that state of pure consciousness, or the ground of consciousness itself, rather than the contents of consciousness. If you're looking at the beauty of flowers, for example, and you're absorbed in the contemplation of the beauty of these forms, then This is more connecting with chit, names and forms, the contents of consciousness, of divine consciousness. Because the idea is that all these forms ultimately reflections of the divine mind. And then if you're engaged in some activity which is very active, which has a spiritual dimension, as many sports do, then it's more to do with the spirit, the principle of flow, movement and change. And also where dancing and music become spiritual practices, it's more dealing with this dynamical aspect of the spirit. But meditation is more to do with the ground of it. Now, you don't have to believe all this or even take it seriously to meditate, and most people who meditate don't. And Sam Harris, for example, goes on being a militant atheist, even though he's an experienced meditator and teaches meditation. He can believe that it's all inside the brain, that there's nothing going on beyond his own brain that's generating these sensations of a connection with a greater being, but there isn't really a greater being, it's just something that's happening as a result of dopamine release and connections inside the brain. And all of us have the choice, really, what to believe. Do we trust our own direct experience? When we have the experience of our mind being connected with something far greater than ourselves? Or do we trust a theory, the materialist theory, that says the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, therefore it's all inside the head? A theory which is notoriously poor on understanding consciousness. The very existence of consciousness is the hard problem for the materialist theory. That's a question we all have to make, whether we put that theory first or our own experience first. We may start, as I did when I started meditating, with a materialist theory of the mind. I thought it was all inside my head. But partly as a result of my own experiences, I came to the conclusion that was too narrow a view, and it was better to trust my own direct experience of consciousness. And this is, again, a point where science and spiritual practices come into fairly close connection, because science, after all, is based on the experimental method, experience. Experiments mean empirical, means experience. Experiments are about experience. And spiritual experience is about experience too. Science is ultimately based on experience. And in French, the same word, expérience, means experiment and experience. So when we're exploring consciousness, is it better to explore it externally through studying the brain, or internally through the actual experience of consciousness itself? And meditation enables us to explore the nature of consciousness directly. Well, and ideally, I think we need both, and that's what the scientific study of spiritual practices is giving us. But it doesn't necessarily commit us to a reductionist view that it's nothing but the activity of the brain. It's true that when people have mystical experiences, particular parts of the brain become active, but that doesn't prove it's nothing but the brain. You're having a non-mystical experience right now of seeing me standing here, and if someone measured your brain activity, there would be changes in your brain associated with the image of me and hearing my words, which would be changes, measurable changes in your brain. But the fact there are measurable changes in your brain when you see and hear me doesn't prove I'm nothing but your brain. Fortunately, for me, I have an independent existence, and it's a kind of interaction. And so it may well be that when our consciousness connects with higher forms of consciousness, if such forms exist, that the brain changes in particular ways, but it doesn't prove that it's nothing but those changes in the brain.